welcome back. Well, I don't know where you live, but here in Wales it's got cold and damp. It's October and I was sitting there the other night absolutely frozen in my sitting room, and I don't really want to put the heating on all the time, so I thought I really should, for a quilt maker and textile artist, maybe I should have a lap quilt. My partner has one which I made, which features in a video back at the beginning of the year, and this is what I'm going to make for me. It's based on 5-inch squares and I'm going to show you how to make it, but I'm really hoping that I've got enough of the fabrics that I want, because I don't want to buy any fabric. As you know, use what you have is my motto, but I really like the colour green. I've found all of these batiks, prints, scraps of things, anything I thought might work. These nice green things here, some lovely magenta, all these beautiful things that I've collected. Some of them are from the ends of projects. I used to make a lot of cushions, ribbon woven cushions, and use batiks to back them, and I've made a lot of commission quilts and things. There's offcuts and all sorts of things. So having worked out how I'm going to construct the quilt, I already know that I probably can't use this one. So I should really calculate what the finished size is, but it's basically 11 5-inch squares going across one way, 13 5-inch squares going the other way, and then it's got a complete border all the way around of 5 inches wide. I've got some good bits and pieces, so what I'll do is I'll go and iron the candidates and try and work out if I've got enough fabric, and that will probably help me weed out a few more. Right, I think I've finalised which fabrics I'm using. What I have discovered while I was ironing things is that you need to use, fat quarters are easier to use than long quarters, and that's because we need 11 squares of each one. So here's a fat quarter. Now this is a UK fat quarter, so this is going to be the same width but not the same length. So this is 19.5 inches across that way, 19 inches that way. If we cut 4 strips of 5 inches, that'll give us 12 squares, and we need 11, so that's perfect. So you can use up fat quarters for this, which is great. So if I just pan around, sorry if it's a bit wobbly, and you can just see the end ones. Although I knew what colours roughly I wanted to use on this, I'll go back in and I'll actually write down next to each one of these what fabric I've chosen to use, so that I don't get in a muddle later. So I'll quickly go and do that, and I advise you to do the same if you're going to do something like this where you want them to go in order. By the time we start cutting up strips and all the rest of it, it's going to be quite hard to remember what we've chosen to do. So I'll go in and write that down, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm literally going to start cutting 5-inch strips off of each of these pieces, and then we'll see where we are. And yes, I know there's greens here that you would never put together, there's purples you'd never put together. The beauty of the design that we're going to do is that each fabric gets to have its own place, so it will make a contrasting line, and that's what we really want to see. So I'm hoping that that will look okay with some of these peculiar choices. So what I'm doing is I'm seeing which way I'd get the least amount of wastage. So this piece measures 21 inches that way roughly, 19.5 that way. So I could cut 3 strips this way, so 1, 2, 3, about there, and then leave a usable piece at that way. But if I cut it along the long way as well, I'm still going to have to cut 3 strips because I need 11 pieces. So I think the least amount of wastage is to cut across the short width, if you see what I mean, so the shorter measurement. If it's over 15 inches and it's a fat quarter, you need to cut 4 strips. If it's obviously more than that, then you only need to cut 3 strips. So I'm just going to square it up. So to do that, what you need to do is to find an edge that's straight. What I do on my rule, I don't know if you can see, there's these lines here. So I'm just going to line up one of these horizontals with the edge of the self edge, and then I've got my straight point to start from. So I need to square the fabric up. So if I put my rule on here, you can see it's a bit skew-iff, so we need to take that piece off first. Making this quilt is not an exercise in accuracy. even I can't hide that difference. And also give yourself as many chances as possible. I say this practically every video that I make. Give yourself as many chances as possible as doing as good a job as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you know you've done your best, that's like half the battle, isn't it? So if you practice with your cutting and measuring and things like that, just hone those skills, because no one can use a rotary cutter the first time either. So those are the strips. That's all of the ones, and I've kept them in order. They're probably not going to stay in order, but I've kept them in order. I'll show you what we're going to do next. Normally, if this was a smaller quilt, you would just stitch all of these pieces together in continuous strips, but this is a little bit bigger, so it's going to be a little bit ungainly. So I'm just going to take 2 of the strips off of this, one of these, because obviously they were all different. Some were fat quarters, some were half meters, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to take out a bit of each, and as I'm sorting it, I'm making sure that I keep everything in the same order, so that when I come to do more, I can do it in the right order. But also, I did write this down, so I've put batik, artichoke, paisley, bright green, limpet purple, because they all mean things to me. So I've just given them all names and written them down the side, so I've got something to refer to. And the only other thing I did was I swapped those around, so that's purple there now and green there. So I'm going to take all of these bits and get a pile in order. I've got a pile to start working on. So this is my end fabric. This is my last one here. So I'm literally going to take each strip and decide if it's a batik, which is the right side and which is the wrong side. It's easier said than done. I think this is the right side. So the first thing we need to do is to prepare this strip. I don't mind having piecing seams in my quilt, so although this is going to look like individually cut 5-inch squares, it actually is going to be made of strips and then cut across. So to make this long enough, I need to just stitch this together first along here. So again, I'll sort through the whole thing and keep it all in order. I don't think there's too many that need stitching together in that way, so that's not too bad. There's only 3 for me that actually need to be pieced into a longer strip. And just put your right sides together and just pop a pin in it, and then when you take it to the machine you can just stitch a little seam along it. I've remembered that what I need to do first is change the needle, because the last project I was doing on the machine was the textile landscape, and I was using a top stitch needle, so I don't want to be wasting my fancy top stitch needles on batik. So I'm using a size 14 needle, a brand new one, nice and sharp. So it needs to be sturdy, but you don't want a 16 because that will just punch its way through the fabric. And if you're like me and you really like batiks, it's very hard going on your machine if you're using a big needle. So I couldn't recommend that. But I was always recommend at the beginning of a project, change your needle. I mean, unless you're just stitching one hem, obviously. Okay, starting at the top of the pile then, I'm just going to pop this in here. Now I know my 1/4 inch seam allowance from the needle to wherever it is, there isn't actually a mark on mine. It's right at the side of the feed dogs, and it will be around there on most machines. And the feed dogs, if you don't know what those are, I don't know if you can see that, it's actually quite spiky. So that's the feed dogs. And what happens is when you put this down with the presser foot on, with the fabric in it, it's this part with the motor that it's got little teeth on it, and it grabs the fabric and it pushes it through. And for all of you that knew that already, well, you've just reminded yourself when we've taught some newer sewers. And I'm just going to use a standard running stitch, not too small, not too big, probably whatever it's set on. Normally, in the interests of saving thread, I would carry on stitching through. What's more important for this is not to get the fabrics out of order. So I'm going to put this back in the pile. And I know if you've done any patchwork and quilting before, you'll know lots of these things, but it's always interesting to see how other people deal with like project organisation in that way. So what we're going to do, we're going to start stitching these together in order. There's the seam that we just did. I'll press that later, it's not important right now. So we take the first fabric. This is fabric number 1. This is fabric number 2. We're going to pin them right sides together. I'm not going to bother doing the whole whole bit. It's just to keep it in order. So I'm going to start with this, stitch this through all the way down. We're going to run out, don't worry, that's all undoable. Don't do any back stitching. We don't want to lock any of these seams in place. We will need to unpick some of them to make the pattern. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. If you're happier stitching one, taking it off the machine, getting the third fabric, stitch that on, take it off the machine, get the fourth fabric, by all means do that. I know it's a lot to keep track of, but what I am going to do is get the next one ready as well. So this is another set here, and I'm going to do that all the way through. I'm going to do them all into pairs in the right order. Right, I've got to my last fabric, which obviously I'm not going to pin onto anything, so I'm just going to hang it on my drawer. Then I'm going to pick up all of these and turn them and start from this side, and we're literally going to stitch all of those strips along the long edge. So I'm going to show you one. I'm sure you know what a straight seam looks like. I'm sure you really don't need to watch me doing it. If you would like to just see a video of me continuously sewing strips, feel free to put that in the comments. Oh, I love watching people sewing. So. And there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've done the first lot of stitching in pairs, so now is my chance to just check that I am actually stitching them together in the right order. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to put these into a pair, and I want to stitch this seam here. So again, I'm going to put just a couple of pins at the top where I'm going to stitch from and which seam I want to stitch. What we're going to do is we're actually going to make a piece of fabric so that we can cut across this way and get our squares, but never actually have to cut out individual squares. So I'm going to take these away and stitch them together. I've finished stitching all those pieces together, and then I've just put the last sets together. So there was the set of 7, which is this one. So there's 3 there, and then I've just pinned that. So that's the bottom section, and then there's the set of 6 here, so that's pinned, that's the very top, and then this will be the middle. Okay, I've stitched those together, and I'm going to show you the ironing. I'm only going to show you a bit on this because I'm using a small tabletop board, which whilst is adequate, and if that's what you've got then use it, it's not the easiest when you start using longer pieces of fabric. So I'll start this off to give you the gist, and then I'm going to go over to my big ironing board. I would have showed you on that, but I can't think where to put the tripod. So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to press all the seams to one side, and that just makes a stronger seam. In dressmaking, often you'll press them open like that, which is absolutely fine for garments that you're going to wear, but for a quilt, you can see if you start to fold this out, all of the tension, the stress of pulling the quilt then comes down to these stitches, whereas if you fold it to one side, if it's pulled, it's got the got 2 layers of fabric, the stitches are there, and it's much less likely to come apart, which is why we do it that way, generally speaking, in patchwork and quilting. So I'm just going to quickly just start off on there. So I've started to press it to one side, and then it's very important to turn it back over and then iron it from the front as well. So we've pressed it in that direction towards me, and so now I'm going to take the iron and start pressing again towards me, and then the foot plate of the iron will actually come into contact with the edge of that fabric, and just push out anywhere where it's not quite opened out how it should do, and then you'll end up with a really nice straight line. So I'm going to go and do all of the ironing like that, so be pressing it to one side on the back first, then turning over the whole thing and pressing it from the front as well. So here's the first piece of fabric. So this is the top, and what we're going to do is cut off 5-inch wide strip, and then you'll see that we'll end up with some squares. So the first thing I need to do is, even now I've been super careful and stitched from one end and stitched in the same direction, it's a little bit wobbly, so I need to even that up. So the first thing we need to do is to just even this up, and instead of working from the outside edge as I did when I was evening up the individual pieces, I'm actually going to work from a seam line, because hopefully these seam lines are straight. So I'm going to work from this bottom seam line here and put one of the lines on top of that, and that should give me a good starting point. I'm hoping there isn't too much trimming to do, because every time you trim you're losing more and more fabric. Now I'm going to cut off 3 or 4 of these to get started, and I'm going to cut some 5-inch strips. So where I've got a 5-inch rule here, it's really easy. I can put this on my nice neat edge and then literally just cut across there, and I know it's 5 inches. And you can see we're pretty much at the maximum of what we can do with a 24-inch ruler here. When you're doing this and there's another bit of fabric, if you just ease, don't yank it away, just ease it slightly and make sure it's all lined up, and really push against the rule at the end, because it's so easy to kick out and do that, and we don't want to do that. This is the bit where it's important that you have a sort of back of the envelope picture of what you're going to do, because it's quite easy to lose track of what the plan was. This is also where the basic Bargello technique comes in the title of the video. If you wanted to do a Bargello quilt or cushion or whatever, it's exactly the same principle. You just use narrower and narrower or wider strips of fabric. But for our purposes, we want squares, so we're sticking with squares. For row one is literally just this strip and this strip pieced together here. So I'm going to take one of these off here. Just before I pin it, I'm going to double check that everything's in order, because now's the time to sort it out if it isn't. So we have got what I've called vintage here, and that needs to join to this one. Literally pin that together. Now this does need to be straight, but you should be able to match up the cut edge with the cut edge on both sides. Row 2 is this one and this one. So first of all, pin together where we've got to join it, just because it would make an enormous piece of fabric. So just like we did with row 1, we're going to pin these 2 together. The next thing we need to do, and this is why we weren't doing any locking stitches, you know, back stitch or anything like that, because we need to unpick this one. So it's handy to have a stitch ripper or a pair of snippers and just gently pick them apart. It's so much easier to stitch strips together than it is to stitch squares together. So we're just going to gently snip through that, and it should start to pull a little. Try not to cut through your fabric. To recap, this is row 2. We've pinned together the 2 strips. We've unpicked this green off of here. So we've taken it from the bottom, and now we need to put it on the top. So just pin those like so. So row 3, so first we need to attach these together. So I'm doing this one and this one. So we'll pin that. And then this time we're going to unpick 2 squares up from the bottom. Just the one seam, but the 2 squares together as a unit. So here's the bottom. So 1, 2, we want to unpick this one. So we need to do a little check. Remember, we're on row 3, so the top of row 3 should be the purple, then my little African print there. I've been trying to think of ways of connecting with my subscribers more, and people that actually, you know, would really love to do a more in-depth workshop or whatever. And I've been racking my brains how to do it, because I would also really like to do some PDFs of different things. I know I've mentioned it before, but I could do, you know, PDFs of hexagon paper, of my quilt designs. I've designed tons of quilts, and it'd be really nice to do, you know, give you a free PDF of one of my quilt patterns. And it would also be a really cool way of, you know, maybe doing a sort of a live event at some point. But I don't want to do that on YouTube. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with YouTube, it's just, it's a bit broad. And the chances of people, you know, the people that are actually interested in textiles showing up on the right day, all of that kind of thing. So I was thinking maybe it's something I could do through Patreon or something like that. Something to think of next year, maybe. The Patreon thing I'm thinking of doing this year, and I have been thinking about it a lot, so I'd love to know your thoughts on it. So this is row 4, so I've just pinned those 2 bits together. So now we need to unpick 3 from the bottom, so we're going to unpick, 1, 2, 3, 3, so it'll end up on this green marble here. So hopefully, if you've stitched all the pieces on and unpicked and moved them to the top, which you saw me do, this is what it starts to look like. So this is why I thought I'd only work on the first 4 strips, just to give you an idea of how it all works. The last thing I'm going to show you is how to actually attach one of these strips of squares to the other. What I'll do is I'll pin them in pairs, so row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, and then I'll stitch those, and then I'll stitch these 2 pairs together then. And I just wanted to show you how to get it so that they actually meet up, because if you've been fairly strict on your seam allowance, you know, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you've pressed them quite well, they should match up. They won't always, and even when you've been doing this as long as I have, I fully expect there to be some squares that just don't match properly, and I can predict which ones they're going to be. These ones, these are just a normal woven fabric. Oh, and that one as well. So having 3 of these together is going to be a little bit interesting. They are going to stretch a lot more than batiks. Batiks are more closely woven cotton, so actually more threads per inch in the cotton. It's a very dense cotton, which is really nice. It's quite fine in the thickness of the fabric, but that's why it's so hard to hand quilt, if anybody's ever tried hand quilting batik. So if we start with row 2, this is row 2 and this is row 1. This is the seam we're going to be working on, so we need to put this right sides together first of all. Normally when you're doing this type of rotary cutting and piecing and everything, you would press your seams alternate ways. In this there's absolutely no point in doing that because they are all being cut off the same fabric. So when you put your right sides together, try and match up that corner as best you can, and then with the back fold there, I'm just flipping it round. So we've got a seam allowance there and a seam allowance there, and that will sort of lock it together. That's how you end up with good points that meet. And it's one of those things, the more you do it, you'll be able to judge by eye, you know, what's going to work best. It's just one of those skills that you learn as you go along, really. And when I take this to the machine, I don't sew over my pins. I know some people do. If you're going to sew over your pins, please make sure you're wearing some sort of glasses, either safety glasses, or if you wear glasses like I do when you're doing close work. The last time I stitched over pins, I managed to shatter a sewing machine needle into about 4 parts, one of which hit my glasses. If I hadn't been wearing them, that would have gone in my eye. So this is the first 4 rows stitched together, and you can see it's starting to take shape now. Pan up there and then down here. I wanted to show you, I've pressed all of this, and what I did was I followed the lines, you know, where I'd flipped it from one side or the other. I just pressed it flat. Every now and again you'll have one that does that, and if I was quilting this, if I was going to hand quilt this, I would probably make sure that it was going to sit flat one way or the other. If I was feeling lazy, I might put a tiny little slit in there so that most of it lays flat. For the purposes of this quilt, I'm not too bothered because I'm probably going to tie this quilt. I think I might even do a whole video about tying it. For people that don't know, a quilt has to be held together with thread, or 3 layers usually, top layer, wadding, bottom layer, and traditionally that's done with hand quilting or machine quilting, where you actually make the stitching a pattern, you know, part of the design. So a tied quilt is where you literally stitch through it once and then you tie it with a little knot. Whilst I would love to hand quilt this, I actually want to use it this year. Tying it will probably take me a couple of hours, whereas hand quilting even something this size would probably take me a couple of days, maybe 4 days. For most people it would take even longer than that. And also, knowing that I wasn't going to quilt this quilt, I have used a lot of batik because I hate hand quilting through batik. Right, so what we need to do when we've done the first set is just trim off the last, cut the last strip. So this makes 5, and then we're missing purple. But I've got more purple pre-cut, so I can stitch that in to complete that block again, and then carry on cutting strips across all the way until I get to the end here. and it looks like most of them will run out at the same time. There'll be a few bits left over, and at that point there's no reason to carry on stitching strips in because we're left with odd bits and pieces. So just put those odd bits and pieces on one side. So I think we will get 6, 7. I think we'll probably only get 7 altogether out of what's left of this, and then I'll put the strips on one side, and then I'll take all the other strips that were pre-cut and stitch them all together, and then cut off these strips again with the squares in, and then hopefully that would be enough. There might be a few odd bits where I need to stitch them in, but come the last row anyway, if you're really short of fabric, you can use all your odd snippets and squares and things, but I'm probably going to do a border of some description with the leftover bits and pieces. I haven't quite decided on what I'm going to do as a border. I do want to do some sort of 5-inch border all the way around, just because it makes a really, really nice size. And I've also decided that this is going to be sort of a 2-part video, because really all there is to show you now is just me sewing at the sewing machine, doing exactly the same of all the other things that we've been doing, which is not that exciting. And this is as far as I've got. Remember, if you don't have sewing equipment like the quilting equipment, don't worry, this can be made with, you do need some sort of ruler. Doesn't have to be a quilting one, it can be any ruler that you can measure with. That's stupid, it wouldn't be a ruler, would it? A rule. And a pair of scissors and a pencil. You could do it that way, you could mark them all out. It will take you a long time. It is quicker with cutting mat and rotary cutter, but I am aware that those can be quite expensive if you haven't already invested in something like that. So don't let that put you off. And then the other thing is, if you don't have a sewing machine, you could piece this all by hand, but in that instance I would suggest that you did actually cut squares, only because hand sewing won't stand up to being snipped through when we're cutting off these strips. So you'd have to make that decision to start with and approach it in a slightly different way. But how to lay it all out and how to estimate fabric and that kind of thing is all identical. And you could also use lightweight upholstery fabrics, offcuts of things. Duvet covers are great, especially if you can get a reversible one. If you've only got a reversible duvet cover with 2 different fabrics, you could do this in a checkerboard instead of trying to lay it out like a, diagonal lines and everything. So there's lots of things you can do with squares, and there's lots of things you can do with very limited equipment and supplies and stuff. So have a go, and I will come back, show you the completed top, and then how to tie a quilt. So I think that might be quite nice as a reveal to come back and see the completed top, and I'll actually do that in my next video. I think that makes sense to do them sort of back to back, so that'll be in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a go and start thinking about using fabric scraps in a different way and saving bits, and also keeping nice and warm and snuggy. If you don't need a lap quilt, you can make a Christmas present for someone. You could have this done, even with waiting for my next video to show you how to tie it all together. You could have this done by Christmas, no problem at all, because you haven't got to learn to hand quilt in between. I will see you all again in a couple of weeks' time. I hope you have a good couple of weeks, and thanks for joining me. Bye!